Hi there. I often get asked how I do my casting on for socks from the toe up. I like to do my socks from the toe up, and I do this nice, neat cast on. That's very little sewing. The only sewing is the tail end of where you start. And so I'm going to demonstrate that today. Sorry, I don't have a broken fingernail and not manicured fingernails, but we're here to learn about the knitting technique. I generally will cast on 10 stitches for each side of the sock. I do that together, and that's the technique I'll show you. And then on each half of the sock, one stitch from the end is where I do increases gradually. So I go from 10 stitches on one side of the sock to 32 stitches. And then because 32 on one side and 32 on the other side equal 64 stitches. That width with sock yarn, and my needle is 2.75 millimeters, does a nice width of sock for my foot. Now, some people may need more stitches, say up to 32 stitches, so you would just keep casting on, or not casting on, but increasing one stitch at each edge, one stitch in from the edge. This particular colorway, it's a nice cotton sock with some nylon or spandex in it. It's made in Germany, and I got it at a wool shop in Edmonton in Canada, and I really like it. It's actually called a colorway of fresh fruit, and this is dragon fruit. But when I saw it, it reminded me of candy canes and birch bark. So that's the way I think of it. But really, what I love about this technique of casting on is it's no sew, except for if I opened it up inside, you'd see the tail end. I'll just show you. Which, if you're knitting with self-striping yarn like this colorway, it's really important that you for some colorways, it may be important. For this one, it is for me, especially if you like attention to detail and are fussy about the striping of your two socks being the same. So I made sure that I measured in from where the first red, because there's a red amount of yarn, and then green, and then red, and then it goes into the white and black area of striping. So I made sure for each sock that I started exactly this amount of white and red in of where I first started casting on, and then that way my two socks are going to be the same with red at the tip of the toe and green next, and then red, and then go on from there. So anyway, these are really cute socks. I still have to knit the other one and sew in the end at the very end. Just another note on socks, I love Jenny's surprisingly stretchy bind off method, and she also has a cast on if you just look it up on YouTube. This one I do a little bit of a variation on what she does, because she does a yarn over between each stitch that she's binding off. I only do it every other stitch, and then I find it's not as loose, but it's not as oh no, you'll see it gets a little bit frilly if you do the full yarn over, increasing a stitch between every stitch before you cast it off. But anyway, yeah, so there's these socks. So I'll show you how I cast those on. If I'm knitting two together, oh, I had started this, so I'll pull it out while I'm talking. Well, you can see how it's going to end up. There's the nice start to it. I've got half of the stitches for the sock on one needle, half on the other. It's all one big circular needle. If you do it this way, kind of the magic loop method, you want a good length to your needle, and you want to be sure it's nice flexible plastic so that it bends. Now this particular needle that I'm going to demonstrate on, first I'll just pull this out. It is only 31 inches from tip to tip, and generally I like to use 100 centimeter one or 40 inches. And I'll do 2 socks on that one. Now the loop kind of gets in the way, but anyway, you get the point. This, I pulled this out to demonstrate. I was reminded, whew, what a beautiful yarn this is. This is actually Koigu. I don't know what the KPPM stands for, but it's made here in Canada, it looks like, Chatsworth, Ontario. But one thing I love about it, yeah, and why I bought it is the friend said how squishy it is. And oh yeah, love squishy yarn. Anyways, beautiful colors too. I've had it for way too long in my stash, but here we go. So I start always by tying a slip knot, and then that's going to be how I anchor it to my needles. And start by putting it on one needle and just pull it tight. And I'm a bit fussy about knots in my knitwork. You can leave that. I used to in my socks, just leave that knot there. But what I've started doing is just having this as a grounding stitch, and then I pull it off while I'm knitting. So I'm going to take that, make sure it's anchored on there, and I'm going to line up the other needle. It gets a bit tricky with the cable in the way. And hold on to the loose tail. And essentially what I'm going to do is wind in a figure 8 around each needle. So that's putting one stitch, if you will, stitch in open air quotes, on one needle, and starting the second stitch on the first needle, so bottom and top needle. And I'm going to go around and around like that. I normally would cast on 10 stitches on each needle using this method, but because I'm just demonstrating, make it 5 stitches on each needle. But if I'm doing socks, I do 10, so 2, 4, 5. On here, 2, 4, 5, but I'm going to be taking this first one with the slip knot off. I'm going to wrap another one there. So now I've got, I'm going to work first from the top needle. So what that means is I'm going to pull out the bottom needle. I'm just holding it between my thumb and my fingers just to keep the stitches in place. Pull out some loose cable, enough to manipulate around on my stitches. Keep in mind I've got the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 wrapped stitches, if you will, on this cable now, and here's the slip stitch that I'll take off. Now I'm going to knit these 5 strands that are on the other needle. In your case, if you're starting to knit a sock, it would be 10. Unless you're starting a kid's sock, I don't know, you can try 5. But so I could knit in through this nice big loop here, but I want to close up that loop a little bit, so I'm going to kind of work my needle in the front of that loop, and then holding snugly with my other yarn that's attached to the ball, not the little slip knot tail that's over here. And I'm going to knit that stitch and then push it off. And then I get the next one. So working on the top one, I'm going to go to the front of that wraparound, and I'm going to knit that, push it off, and the front, just kind of put a little twist in that loop of yarn, closes it up nicely but keeps it flexible still. And for the last one, same thing, you see the big loop there, so I'm going to go through this side and knit that. So now I've got 5 stitches on the right needle. My left needle is now free. I'm going to kind of uncoil that loop, and I'm going to switch it around so that what I just knit onto is now the bottom needle. I'm going to pull this cable for the top needle up and then maneuver the stitches. It's a bit awkward if you're not used to working with it like this. And the bottom needle for the stitches I just knit, I'm going to pull that forward so that I've got this cable and loop my needle over here. So it's called magic loop. You got a loop always at one end. And I'm going to slide my stitches over. I'm going to leave my tail end. So this is the one where it's got that slip stitch that kind of anchored things to the needle to help me start. And I'm actually going to just pull it off, and it's a slip knot, so I'm going to pop it out and that pulls out that slip knot, and now I have no more knots, and I will just sew this loose end in later. I'm going to tuck it in behind, hold it in my fingers, and I'm going to carry on knitting the other half of the sock on the top needle. So again, if I go like this, it's a big loop. For this one, I'll knit into the back of the stitch, bring my bottom needle yarn up. Generally for that first stitch, I like to go a bit snug, pull on this other tail here. And so this one I'm going to knit into the back of the stitch to give it a little bit of a twist rather than going this way and there's a great big loop that way, great big hole. So we're doing 5 stitches on each needle. So this really is technically the first row. And that's the first row done of both. And then pull my other cable now, bring the other stitches back onto the other needle. And so it's kind of small because I only did 5 stitches, but if you had 10 and 10, you'd have a total of 20 stitches. So that's the first row done and the cast on. And from here, to do the part of to get the sock width to increase, now we're going to work on increasing 1 stitch at each edge of each half of sock, and we're going to do 1 stitch in from each edge. So what that means is I'm going to make sure what I know which row I'm coming off of. So I finished knitting this one because that's where my long tail is if I pull it. So I'm going to pull forward my needle for my bottom stitches to go on my cable, and I'm going to knit the first stitch, not with the tail but with the actual yarn that's joined to the ball. Now I'm going to increase 1 stitch because I've knit 1 stitch, and you do an increase 1 stitch before each edge. So I can do it by picking up a loop, and I put it on the other needle, then I work it around like this. It can be tricky if the yarn is really fine or it's very, very tight, and then I can knit like that, and that has increased 1 stitch. Or alternatively, I'll just pull that off. Keep my 1 stitch. There's my loop. Alternatively, I can knit twice into my second stitch. Knit once in the front and then knit once in the back. And then that's going to increase. Whatever way you want to do it is fine. So I'll just carry on and knit to 1 stitch before the end and pick up my loop. Or if you wanted to knit 2 stitches into that last knit stitch, second last knit stitch, you could do it that way. And then I'll knit my last stitch on that half of the sock. And so now I'm just going to switch it around again. Using the magic loop method, you have to pull through the cable, and it's a bit fussy with your needles, a bit more fussy than double pointed needles, using 4 or 5 of those. But I like it. I never lose my needles. When I had double pointed, I always lost my needles. So now I can see this yellow is my tail. It's kind of nice that I'm using this variegated yarn so you can see how things go. And I'm going to start the second row, which is a first increase row of the second half of the sock. So again, I knit my edge stitch. You're not going to increase before the edge. You want to have that edge stitch. And then I'm going to increase this method. I'll show how I pick up that loop in between 2 stitches, and I put a twist in it, knitting it through the back like that. Now I'm just going to knit until I get 1 stitch to the end. I pick up a loop in there, put it on my other needle, then I kind of dip in and switch it around so it gives me more of an easier way to knit that loop, and it puts a twist in it, and then knit that. So in this case, in this example, I showed you 2 different techniques for increasing, but you shouldn't use different techniques on the same sock. Just pick one and go with it. But what we've done is actually now we have 2, 4, 2, 4, 6, 7. Oh yeah, because I have 5. If I had, so I've increased 2 stitches on each side of this sock. So you got 2 sides, they're joined, but it really is a matter of one side and one side. So to knit the sock, I just keep doing that increase 1 stitch away from each edge stitch on this side and on this side. Now, because I'm using the magic loop method, I'm always going to be knitting, just like when if you're using double pointed needles, you're always knitting to do your stockinette, unless you have some other pattern to do in your sock. And so again, pull that tail out of the way, and I'll just do this one more time. Knit my edge, increase 1 stitch on the right side of this side of sock, and then knit across. And so you keep increasing 2 stitches per side, which is 4 stitches per round or row of sock, until you get to your magic number of how wide you want your sock to be. So I'm increasing here 1 stitch before my edge, and just like that, easy as anything. And then whoops, and then I keep on pulling the needles through and the cable through, and that's the way you go. You just keep increasing. But again, look how nice that cast on is, and I just have to sew in my loose end, my tail, at the end of knitting. So once you finish casting on and you get 64 stitches or 72 or whatever width works for your foot or the loving foot that you're knitting for, and then you just knit around and around and around, 1/2 of a sock at a time, one side of the sock at the time. It's hard to, I don't know the terminology to use, but knitting across the one, you could say front and back if you want. And it's really, you're just knitting a tube. Size it on your foot to make sure that it's working, or you can knit a swatch on your needles with your yarn and see how many stitches there are per inch, and measure your foot and add a couple stitches just for some ease, because you don't want it too tight on your foot. And then yeah, I just knit a tube sock. If I'm doing a tube sock, I go all the way up just straight. Now this looks a little funky in the design, and that's because this sock actually has a heel in it, and I used Cat Bordy's sweet tomato heel technique. So you can see there are some very soft wedges in here, and in between each wedge that you do of short rows, you knit 2 rows around, and that's why this self-striping yarn came out this way. I'm not sure if I like it, but you know what? This pair of socks is for me, so I'll take it. You could always cut your yarn for self-striping if you wanted a certain color in here, and could be knit your heel in a different color, could knit your toe in a different color as well. But I love the gentle slope and roundness of Cat Bordy's sweet tomato heel. In this case, I did, I think, 2.5 wedges. It's up to you as to the roundness of what you want. And then I just kept, I don't increase any stitches, and then you pick up, and you only knit on half or 2/3, I think, of the sock to do the heel, and then just eventually pick all the stitches back up and just keep knitting a straight tube. So this is a heeled sock, but again, it started the same way, casting on using the looping figure 8 on the circular needle, a nice length circular needle, then increasing 1 stitch, 1 edge stitch in for each half of the sock. So no sewing or anything in there, and I will fill in that one little hole when I do the tail. It seems to be a little, it seems a bit bigger, but anyway, that's how I do it. And I can knit 2 socks at a time, or 1 sock if it's a shorter cable. So have fun knitting, and I hope you found this helpful.